So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum Deus Vult. God wills it. God Himself wants this live stream. And let's start with the president. A great comeback, Amedeo Maddaluno.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening to all of you.
I have a quick question. How many divisions does the Pope have?
He has a lot. He really has a lot, because if one division, okay, end of the day. If one division is, let's say, 30,000 men take 1,200,000,000 people, divide by 30,000 men, and you'll see how many divisions the Pope has. He has quite a few, and that's kind of the theme of the evening.
But then they say they'll excommunicate us. Luckily, thank God, I'm an atheist, so I get by pretty well.
So, out of honesty towards those listening to us, I have to say I'm a practicing Catholic. But tonight we'll try to be completely objective, because Mirko and I have decided to do a series. Since we do geopolitical country profiles, we've covered all the areas of the world, the middle powers, the regional powers, the small powers, and now we're doing the great powers, and we started with China. Then we thought, well, after China, Russia, and the United States, right, the great global powers, but I had an idea. There's another great power, which is one of the smallest states in the world, the Vatican. So tonight we'll talk about the Vatican city-state as a geopolitical power, and we'll talk about the Catholic world. Rather than the Catholic Church as a purely religious organization, we'll talk about the Catholic world from a political and geopolitical point of view. Good evening.
Many greetings to Antonio Stico, who writes to us from Krakow. I've been there. Beautiful churches, by the way. And we'll talk about it. Look, I'll also add things as we go along for those who join, because in any case, there is a strong connection between the Church, the Pope, and what happened in Poland in the 1980s.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, so let's get right to the heart of it. The phrase attributed to Stalin during the negotiations on the European order immediately after World War II, someone pointed out to him the difficulty of directly opposing the Catholic Church, which had a significant social presence in the Czech Republic. In Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in a whole series of countries with a majority or at least a strong Catholic presence in Eastern Europe. And Stalin responded as only Stalin would to this statement. How many divisions does the Pope have? What can he do to scare me? Now, if geopolitics, as we always say, is the application of power to geographic space and therefore also to human geography, not just physical geography. As we were saying, the Pope can count on a few divisions. Let's move on to the next slide. So, if geopolitics is the discipline that studies the relationship between political power and geographic space, then religions, especially organized ones, are geopolitical actors and practice geopolitics. They operate within a geographic space and manage power. They mobilize the values, beliefs, and convictions of human beings. They mobilize information, they mobilize politics, they mobilize money. And as we will see in the case of the Vatican, they also mobilize intelligence. Stalin had to know this.
During World War II, besides the fact that many, including Germans who escaped, passed through Genoa, they did so with the mediation of some bishops, in the sense that in any case there were major ones. Fascism had enormous connections and mediation, obviously with the Concordat and so on with the Church. But during the Second World War, should we do a live stream? Apart from that, the Church mediated many negotiations between nations. They were really the vehicle through which people tried to get in touch with other countries.
Also through the embassies of countries at war.
Exactly. So they were always the vehicle for this, not to mention earlier times when the Church had much more power. Even Napoleon, who was not a believer, still wanted to be married by the Pope. He wanted to make peace with the Pope, etc., because he understood that it was still useful for control. Exactly for the guys.
Symbols matter, symbols matter. The great drama of the human being is the sense of finiteness, right? Drama in the Greek sense, the sense of finiteness. And nobody likes to surrender to the fact of being just a pile of breathing proteins. So we all try to ask ourselves questions about the metaphysical dimension as well. We exist in a symbolic dimension. Those who manage the metaphysical and record these symbols through ancient traditions hold significant influence. Now, look at the map of the world. Here, the main religions that exist in a territory have been colored with different colors. As you can see, Christianity has a significant presence not only in the northern hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere. You have two continents, the Americas, which are majority Christian. Then you have a good part of Africa in the southern hemisphere, and you have Europe, meaning from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and a fair part of Oceania as well, plus the Philippines. Most of this Christian world is Catholic, Apostolic, Roman. That is a world that identifies with the doctrine and hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Eritrea is Christian by a slight majority, yes, just like Ethiopia.
Someone is asking why the Philippines. Is it because of American occupation?
No, Spanish occupation.
Spanish and then American. So that's what brought Christianity. And someone says, well, yes, Ethiopians, these places here, Copts, exactly.
Exactly.
There was also an Italian massacre of Coptic priests.
We have Morgano, a free man, who tells us that in Eritrea, 52% are Muslims. I actually think he's right, but as you can see, these are percentage points. In Ethiopia, it's slightly the opposite. 52% are Christians, Copts, and Muslims follow. Philippines, Philip II of Spain, Catholicization of the local populations. Then we have India, where there is a Hindu majority. Tens of millions of Christians, but they are still just a drop in the ocean. Hindus with over 100 million Muslims, mostly Sunnis. We have the large Islamic belt in what is the Greater Middle East region, from Morocco to Kazakhstan. This region is called, in the geopolitical schools of the American Armed Forces, the Greater Middle East, the broader region. In the Middle East, as they say, there is Islam, there is sand, there is oil. So the Greater Middle East, Islam is one of its characteristics, with some small Muslim pockets in Europe. Look at Albania, which is a country where there is a relative majority of Muslims. Buddhism is mainly in Southeast Asia and Indochina, with an important Buddhist pocket in Mongolia. China, here they call it unaffiliated, because officially it's a communist regime. Actually, no. We'll come back to this. I'll dedicate a segment to this topic. There's a resurgence of religiosity in China, which has a specific and syncretic nature in the country's history. Just like in China, Japan, in the Koreas, and even in Vietnam, folk religion and local religions are experiencing a big comeback, a strong emphasis on the typical cults of East Asian syncretism. So
let's start right away with Shinto in Japan, which you can't really place geopolitically with others. Yes, it's true that this map probably refers to religious or lukewarmly religious people, those who consider themselves Christian but maybe aren't practicing, and so on. It's interesting that for the first time, countries like the Czech Republic or Estonia appear, whose populations even consider themselves unaffiliated. That is, they don't believe.
There's a belief. These are the countries where I would say, yes, there is a slight majority of non-believing population. These are countries where what had a big impact was not so much the communist regime itself, but rather the communist regime on populations that were already becoming atheist on their own. So since Estonia has a Lutheran majority, there is a trend toward atheism in Protestant countries. And even the Czech Republic, although the relative majority of religious people are Catholic, actually has a troubled relationship with Catholicism. So these are the two areas of the continent with the largest European majority, at least relative to others. So faith and religion, how many religions are there in the world? This is another map from ISP that shows you the division by continent, as the English speakers would say, the breakdown by continent of the various types of religion. You can see that the Muslim area of the world is unmistakably Africa. It's the area impacted by Islamic culture, with interesting growth in Africa and a significant presence in Asia. Asia is the most diverse area of the world, let's say, while Christianity has a significant impact on the culture of European civilization and on that of the two Americas. So it's for Asia.
It's more divided also because of millennia-old cultures, insular issues, as you can also see from the geography. So, for example, the Japanese developed their own way. Australians are former English prisoners, so obviously they brought that kind of religion there. So it's almost normal that influence is even harder to carry over.
Sure. I mean, basically, it's the, how can I say, it's the continent with the greatest cultural wealth. It's also the most populated continent in terms of people. So it's normal that beliefs, languages, and cultures multiply there. So then let's take another step, starting from this slide. Religion isn't geopolitics just because it impacts cultures and people's consciences, but also because religious organizations move money and wield political influence. But because religious groups or religious organizations end up controlling entire states, those that we commonly call theocracies. Now, it is said that the regime of the Islamic Republic of Iran, not the Islamic Republic of Japan, as someone mentioned in the chat, that's something else. The regime of the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, is defined as a theocratic regime. That's not entirely correct. Theocracy is the government of God. In this sense, the only theocracy on the face of the earth, or rather, the only two theocracies on the face of the earth were Nepal during the monarchy until a few years ago, because the king of Nepal was considered an incarnation of Vishnu, so a deity. And Japan, where the emperor is considered of divine origin, so a divine figure. Let's debunk the legend that Hirohito is said to have renounced his divine origins. That's something the Americans said. There's no statement from Hirohito saying, I renounce being the eternal father. That's a sloppy translation. Por Coracento.
I'm looking for an heir, if anyone is interested, especially in this period, speaking of current geopolitics. Since he doesn't have a male heir, it's a problem for them. Given the tradition, they're looking for a successor from the royal family.
It's been a problem since the 19th century when they established the Salic law. Actually, the Japanese imperial family had at least 1 to 3 female empresses in the early centuries. The important thing is that they are descendants, because through the female line,
according to the Salic law.
Exactly. I mean, the family has to be that one. It can even have a female line as long as the daughter marries a third cousin from a side branch, right? From Pescara, like Fantozzi's, and the line is preserved. The important thing is that the descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu is maintained. That's all. But the thing about the pure Salic law, I mean only male descent for the throne, is something that came later in Japan. Now, if there's any Japanologist, please correct me if I'm saying something wrong. So 2 theocracies. Countries where religious groups and organizations have control of the situation. Many Muslim countries have a strong religious influence and Sharia, that is Islamic law, as a source of law. Saudi Arabia doesn't have a constitution because they have the Quran, for example. Many examples could be given. Well, the state of Israel itself is putting into its constitution that it is the Jewish state, meaning the state of those who belong to that ethno-religious group, with all the controversies that this brings. And in Europe, we have a religious organization, the Catholic Church, which, since the donation of Sutri, controls a state, a territory. If this isn't geopolitics, I'll let you be the judge. Not to mention when the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a sultan who also claimed the title of Caliph Khilafa, successor of the Prophet for Sunni Islam, a position abolished by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. So, as you can see, the religious influence is present in many state organizations, even in some you wouldn't expect. Can you show the next slide, please? The legal aspect doesn't capture everything. For example, we've talked about Japan, Nepal, Iran, and the Vatican, which I call clerocracies, meaning countries that are governed entirely or in part by the clergy. But we also have, among others, I repeat, one that's a republic, because the Vatican is practically an absolute monarchy. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a republic with a parliament, constitution, elections, and so on. But also, there are countries that are, in fact, unexpected. In Sweden, the king must be Protestant. Look at the countries that have an official state religion. England, Anglicanism. Look at the countries that have a sort of preferred religion, meaning they make agreements or concordats with the state. In Italy, the Catholic Church, but there are other religions that have agreements with the Italian Republic, so there are different levels of recognition. Then there are countries that don't have this kind of regulation, and there are countries that are generally hostile to religious institutions. Imagine that, yes, the last communist countries, so China, Vietnam, Laos, North Korea, and Cuba, plus a whole series of republics that retain the old Soviet state's suspicion of religion. The stance of Central Asia, where the generally secularist governments are worried about Islamic radicalism. That's the point.
As you can see, a religious state can exist without an official religion. Let me give you an example, the almost divine origin of Kim Jong-un's dynasty. They replaced religion with a personality cult.
But what is it really? It's the ancestor worship of Confucianism. Millennia-old cultures and religions are so deeply rooted in people's consciousness, soul, and history that it's hard to eradicate them. I mean, I say this with a certain satisfaction as a religious man. I'm sorry for those in the 19th century who said, with the guts of the last pope, we'll hang the last king. All the kings are gone. At most, some of them sing at Sanremo, but there are still popes.
So there's still time.
Fair point, touché. As you can see, yes, even in these countries, and then we'll talk about China, and then we'll talk about Vietnam. So here we're talking about the legal situation. Obviously, in many Muslim countries, it's forbidden. Unfortunately, it's forbidden to be an atheist. That is, you have to choose one of the religions of the book, which you can practice with more or less restrictions and more or less harm to your religious freedom and prohibition of proselytism. But you can't say, I am an atheist. For example, in Iran, in fact, as we'll discuss shortly, the rising atheism in Muslim countries is captured by informal surveys. But officially it is forbidden, I believe, even in Republican countries like Egypt, mind you. Moreover, many of these countries, according to their constitution, have a president, even though they are Republican countries, who must be Muslim. With the problems that the Assad family had in Syria, because they were Alawites, and for many Muslims, Alawites are already considered almost outside of Islam. It was Khomeini who recognized the Alawites as members of the larger Shia family, and therefore as members of the Islamic family. This, in a sense, legitimized the Syrian Alawite regime.
So if I go to Iran, I at least have to say that I am a Safavid Shiite.
No, you have to choose one of the religions of the book. And in many countries, your religion is indicated on your identity card. In Europe, I think only in Greece, but they are moving past this custom, which I personally consider outdated for Europe. In Muslim countries, you have to be either Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, or belong to some other small religions mentioned in the book, in the Quran.
That's the point. Basically, if it's not on the menu, it's not considered.
If it's not on the menu, you can't order it. Let's see, after this introduction, next slide, the fourth great power in the world. This small state inside Rome within the Leonine walls, which is called Vatican City. With St. Peter's Square, the gardens, the museums, the apostolic palaces, here is a nice map. This very small state, which I believe has the highest density of works of art per square meter in the world, because, and on the side, some data about the Catholic Church, so the ecclesiastical staff. Look at the numbers to help you understand how much weight they carry. I can already hear the objection. Yes, these are those who declare themselves Catholic or who are registered as such because they were baptized. Then maybe they'll never set foot in church and so on. We'll come back to this. Keep in mind that in Christianity, once you're baptized, you're baptized. That is, getting unbaptized is extremely difficult. There's a bureaucratic procedure. I did it, it can be done. But it's difficult, it's long.
You don't just send a letter honestly with the request and so on. I did it. It was during my half metalhead phase, so I did it at the Church of the Seven Saints in Livorno. They reply after 6 months, but yes, technically you can do it. Because if you can't do it, in fact, they send you an undertaker who tries to convince you not to do it, but I sent him packing.
Technically, you can do it. It's possible. It's difficult. It's complex. It takes time in this sense. What's the point? For Christianity, he is considered a Christian. I'm not saying Catholic, that is a member of the Catholic Church. He is considered a Christian. Anyone who accepts Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, anyone who is baptized, and pay attention, the churches consider baptism valid no matter who administers it, as long as the person administering it is baptized. That is, in theory, in cases of extreme necessity and urgency, which was useful during the Stalinist persecutions, in the gulags and so on, any baptized person can baptize. You don't need a priest. That is, I, as a baptized person, could baptize someone who asks me, using water and sprinkling it. And a Lutheran can baptize a Calvinist, a Pentecostal, basically anyone who is Christian can baptize, and that baptism is valid even for the Catholic Church. You're a Christian. This is really a concept that is accepted by all the churches. In the divisions,
in 2,000 years, they stole it. They gave it to the Order of the Knights. Can a horse?
Well, but the appointment as a knight now, as a big fan of Game of Thrones, the knighting is borrowed. It takes on a sacred character by borrowing the rituals of baptism and confirmation. It enters into that deeply Christian cultural context. Which baptisms are not considered valid by Christian churches? For example, those of some small groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, because for Jehovah's Witnesses, Christ is not God. In a certain sense, he is a savior, but not Lord. So the baptism of Jehovah's Witnesses is not a Christian baptism, thank you. That of Pentecostals or evangelicals is. And for them, our Catholic baptism is valid. At least that's how it should be. Now, I'm asking you for the next slide. No.
He's talking about a number, about the numbers, even about the church staff, which is an army.
It's an army, so much so that one important figure in the history of the church, St. Ignatius of Loyola, invented a religious order with those military ranks that has a general. The Jesuits. The general of the Jesuits is called the Black Pope because of his power. In fact, there was a rule in the church. The general of the Jesuits and the Pope could never be the same person, and a Jesuit Pope was not welcomed. We know when this rule came about, at least from the previous round, it sounds similar. But why and for whom? Jesuits are the soldiers of Christ who were supposed to oppose the rising Protestant movement and evangelize the new colonies that Europe was creating around the world. Now, there are many. There is the strength of the Catholic Church, its organization, the fact that it is structured, and the strength of the Protestants. At least not the historic Protestant churches, which have taken a very rationalist turn. The strength of the new Protestant churches, the more charismatic ones, evangelicals, Pentecostals, and so on, is their closeness to the people. which at times in the Catholic world, there's no point denying it, maybe is a bit lacking, but the Church with its organizational ability and its doctrinal rigor has managed to survive for 2,000 years. And to overcome various challenges, because today we say, well, there's a secularization of the world that threatens the Catholic Church. There's Islam that threatens us, right? How much political propaganda is built on an Islamic threat that, for me, doesn't exist in Europe? Not at all, not even demographically, and we'll see that later. And yet there have been periods in the history of the Church when people truly thought that Catholicism was about to disappear, starting from the barbarian invasions. With the barbarians, who were Arian Christians, to medieval Europe, with Christianity reduced practically to the Carolingian Empire and the Byzantine one, with the rising Islamic military threat, and with communism. So several times in the history of the Church, there was fear that it might disappear. It has always faced and overcome these challenges, which is no small feat. Among such ancient institutions in the world, we basically only have the Japanese dynasty. The imperial dynasty, which is 1,400 years old, 1,500, give me a break, and the British monarchy, which dates back to 1066. As I say, the fourth oldest institution is the San Remo Festival, then I can't think of any others.
Which is almost a religion in Italy.
Which is almost a religion in Italy. So you understand the impact this has on people's culture. A critic might say it had a negative impact. But be careful, over the centuries, in the more complex part of medieval history, those centuries where we have very few written records, the 6th and 7th centuries AD, I don't want to make things up. On average, those who preserved classical culture in the monasteries, the ecclesiastical world, those who addressed the issue of a social doctrine, that is, all of this had an impact on the history of the West. Is it correct to say that the Church's approach has always been hostile to scientific progress? Is it correct to say that it was only Protestantism that created capitalism, as Max Weber said? Because then Ferdinand Brodel goes and looks at the data and sees that in the merchant cities of the 15th and 16th centuries, there were both Protestant capitalists and Catholic capitalists. So the Church has not always been a reactionary, regressive force tied to the past. The Church becomes reactionary with the French Revolution because it is frightened by Jacobinism. The view of the Church as regressive and anti-scientific originated during the Enlightenment. The idea of the Church...
I don't really agree. I've read some books that more or less calculated how much human progress has been slowed down by religion.
Okay, yes.
In terms of scientific discoveries, I'll throw it at you with a joke that Woody Allen would say, reaction for the right things.
So I mentioned this at the beginning. I have a bias about this. It's hard for me to speak badly about the religious phenomenon in general, and I try to present the positive aspects. For example, witch hunts. Witch hunts are not something from the Middle Ages because they happened between the 1400s and 1500s, so after the Middle Ages ended, with peaks in the 1600s. It's not something from the Catholic world because it happened mostly in the Protestant world, and it's something tied to a historical moment of booming superstition. In the Middle Ages, in the 11th and 13th centuries, we had bishops, churchmen, and clerics who said these were stupid superstitions and preached to people not to believe in witches. Torture and on crimes and punishments. 18th century, yes.
No, it's full of fakes, the Iron Maiden and so on. This here would be Utra Sabage, who deals with modern history and especially with the history of, help me, religious persecution.
Witch hunts, he says.
Yes, those things. Very exaggerated myths. Many things have really been passed down, exaggerating the numbers, the forms, the methods, and so on and so forth.
For example, with On Crimes and Punishments, there's Cesare Beccaria. We trace the criticism of torture back to him. The Enlightenment, right? With the Enlightenment, people started saying no more torture, no more Inquisition. Actually, we already had theologians and legal scholars, medieval clerics like Alberico da Rosciate, who was also from Bergamo like me, who in the late Middle Ages started saying that torture shouldn't be used during interrogations. Because when you torture someone, you're being sadistic, you're enjoying it, it's the devil entering you. The defendant has rights after all. So, mind you, the situation is complex. Religions and the Catholic Church are not just regressive forces in the history of humanity. I give you this as food for thought. Then obviously they've done tons of awful crap and maybe they keep doing them.
But there's a beautiful quote by Caparezza that they're mentioning. God gave me a brain. If I didn't use it, I would be disrespecting him.
Nothing to add.
This quote by Caparezza is beautiful. Absolutely makes sense. Nothing to add.
So the Catholic Church, besides having a state, also has a police force and intelligence services. We'll come back to that. One of the important financial institutions as well, the IOR, Institute for the Works of Religion, which is not a bank, it's not legally a bank, it's something else, it's a piggy bank. But as far as I know, it's not a bank. It is not subject to supervision by the Bank of Italy. It does not have a banking license, neither from Italy nor from the European Union. So legally, it is not a bank. It's called the Institute for the Works of Religion, and it has a truly global presence. It is the single largest denomination demographically, rivaling Sunni Islam, with Sunni Islam growing a bit faster. Here we have a map from Limes, which gives us some numbers. The percentage of Catholics in the various countries. Then, obviously, Mirko, please share these slides so we can make them available. And at the end, you'll also find the calculations. Another map on the next slide, please. Where are the Catholics? Because when you think of Christianity, the Catholic Church, you think of Europe. Yes, Italy has an important number of Catholics, Spain, Poland, compared to the population living in those countries. Germany, which we consider in our minds the cradle of Protestantism. Great Britain is no joke either. In England, there is even a movement of believers from Anglicanism to the Catholic Church. But look at the Philippines. Look at Brazil. Look, despite the inroads made by the evangelical churches. Look at Mexico. And look at the United States of America. Look at the United States of America, where I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Catholics are still the single largest denomination. Taken all together, Protestants are more numerous in the United States. But as a single church, the largest one, I think, is the Catholic Church. Then, well, Africa is not poorly represented. So you start to understand that we're talking about an institution that is also a state, that is also a religious group, and that has a global presence. 1 second, I'll close the window since street noise is coming in.
I'll be right back. Yes. In the meantime, I'll keep things going by juggling those invisible things. Note that Poland must have about 40 million inhabitants, 42, 43. The vast majority are Catholic. By the way, it wasn't always like that. Because if we think about the battles between the Knights of the Teutonic Order and the Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom, actually, they weren't Christians. They were being Christianized by the Teutonic Order. At least that was the official excuse. Then they took their own path, as often happens with these orders that start with an idea and then seize power and focus so much on power itself. But then they basically became the main force behind Christianization in Central and Eastern Europe.
Exactly.
It's interesting to see how religion then becomes functional also to gain support and avoid problems. Surely this Christianization of Poland spared them from further Teutonic Knights coming to cause trouble. But the war between Christians did not.
Allora, so actually those lands in Central and Central Eastern Europe, nowadays, if you call the Poles Eastern Europeans, they get furious. Central Europe, so let's say Central and Central Eastern Europe, let's put it that way, are the areas of most recent Christianization in Europe. There were still pockets of paganism even in the 14th century. But be careful. In reality, traces of paganism and traditional cults remain throughout Europe. Carnival, aren't those the Latin Saturnalia? What did the Catholic Church do? It realized that it couldn't go directly against paganism, so it absorbed it. So we put Christ's birth on December 25th, Mithra's turn. The pagan fertility festivals. We take them. We allow people for those days of the year to dress up as women, get drunk, eat, let loose. The guy got it.
Customs that are typical of paganism. The fish-shaped hat that used to belong to priests. There are many things that are taken from here and there, but it's a smart method. Because in the end, you have to absorb what came before and transform it. Not set yourself against it, because that's the easiest method. It was also the Roman method, if you look at it. Yes. So what influence did this way of thinking have on the Roman technique of controlling people simply by absorbing them without forbidding too many things?
A great Jesuit, Francesco Saverio, goes to China, dresses like a Chinese person, learns Chinese, translates Catholic and Christian sacred texts into Chinese, and he goes, how do I explain the Madonna, the Virgin, to the Chinese? I take Guan Yin, the Buddhist goddess of benevolence, who is represented as a good woman, and I superimpose the image of the Virgin onto that of Yin, which is actually the Bodhisattva, the Buddhist saint of Avalokiteshvara from India. So even China, the great empires absorb, the great empires absorb. They don't go down and wipe out the legacy of everything that was there before. Isn't that right, Mr. Putin? Great empires have the strength of their own civilization. They fear no one.
It's a method they also used in Japan. It didn't work very well. Francesco Saverio, who was a Jesuit missionary, I can't remember if he was of Italian or Portuguese origin and so on, brought the Christian religion to Japan. And they converted very quickly, about 300,000 of them, except that Japan was obsessed with shutting itself off. And they basically massacred all the Christians, so much so that only hidden Christians remained.
Yes, Kakure Kirishitan, yes.
Kakure Kirishitan, something like that. And anyway, they managed to survive inside, so much so that it still exists even today, basically.
These small groups, there was this church that was recovered later. If you've seen the TV series Shogun, you see that there is a phase before the unification of Japan by the Tokugawa of the spread of Christianity. Because the Tokugawa or Nobunaga, no, not Nobunaga, it was actually the Tokugawa clan who tried to eliminate it, to close Japan off from Christianity because they feared it was a fifth column of European imperialism. They were right. In many cases, they were right? Many European empires sent missionaries ahead as a force for cultural opening and then entered politically. The Teutonic Knights did both things at the same time. There you go. So, now next slide. A few numbers, a bit of demographics. Christians as a whole are the most widespread and numerous religion in the world, followed, of course, by Islam. That category should include the Chinese, but actually in China, people declare themselves this way. But that's not exactly accurate. Last summer, around this time, I was in Shanghai. We went to the oldest Buddhist temple in Shanghai, and it was full of young people praying. Young people praying to Buddha, and I asked the guide, but you here are supposed to be communists and so on. How come I see the temple full of young people? And she repeated the phrase to me. In China, there is religiosity, but officially the country is atheist. That's it. Yes. Okay, but why do I see that in China there is religious freedom, but officially the country is atheist? Yes, but I asked you to explain to me a third time. In China, there is Stop, don't tell me what they told you to say. Tell me what you think. Yes, actually, many young people pray, especially for university exams, to pass the exams. There is a return to religiosity among young people. The Chinese and the Japanese also have a history of syncretism, Confucianism as a philosophy of life, on which popular paganism, Taoism, and Buddhism in China are layered. In Japan, Confucianism as a philosophy of life, along with Shintoism and Buddhism. Marriage is performed with the Shinto rite. The rites of passage for youth and childhood are done with the Shinto rite. The rites of life and funerals are performed with the Buddhist rite. The moment of introspection of mourning is Buddhist, so that unaffiliated. However, well, these are data from Pew Research, which is authoritative. The growth of Islam is certainly very important, solid. Christianity is also growing, but at a slower pace. Catholicism and evangelical Christianity are growing, but at a slower pace. They are growing through conversions and only in Africa through demographics. Islam is growing due to demographics and actually very little through conversions, less than one might think. Then there is data that isn't captured here. That is the fact that in the historic lands of Islam, meaning in the Arab countries, Iran and Turkey, there is a reaction among young people to a whole series of impositions. So there is a trend toward atheism, especially in Tunisia, the most secular Arab country.
It's interesting that, well, Christianity has always had these works, even a bit hidden in a way. I come there to give you a hand because you're in a bad situation and so on, and I also use it as a way to gain a religious foothold. I don't remember any major humanitarian missions carried out by Muslims. I mean, using that method as a way in, no, not in that sense. Then obviously, since it's centered in Africa, and Africa is where the population is exploding, just think about Nigeria. It was 80 million in the 70s. Now it's 230, something like that.
Africa is the only place where the population is really increasing. In other places in Asia, you see a population increase, but it's just an inertial increase. You have a lot of young people, you have a lot of women of childbearing age, and if each of these women has just one child, the population increases, and then it starts to decrease. In the Far East, it's already decreasing. Actually, in China, they are very generous with their census numbers. Maybe they've added about 80 million more people. The Chinese have this habit of faking the numbers. In India is huge. But Indians now have just a little more than the replacement rate, the famous 2.1, and they will fall below the replacement rate. You shouldn't look at the stock, you should look at the flow. Don't look at the curve, but at the derivative of the curve. That's how it's done in demography and statistics. In Africa, no, the population is growing and people still have children. Actually, even there, in the 1970s, there were 6 to 8 children per woman. Today, maybe it's 5, but 5 is still a lot. In a country like Nigeria, with all those young people and all those women of childbearing age, of course. So that's where the increase comes from. That's where you see the rise of Islam. I mean, there's this legend that Muslims will conquer Europe, but why? Because yes, within a generation, Muslim women adopt the reproductive behaviors of the native population within 1 or 2 generations.
That's a good question.
Of conversion, so of many things, principles of an innovation that manages to affect demography. Could it be? Could it be? I don't have an answer to this question. I mean, if the question is, could it be? The answer is yes. If it's something else, I don't know. So, but the question...
Maybe it's more stable in the sense that I do see a certain stability in the Christian world, at least in recent years. Yes.
Basically, yes. Basically, yes. Sostanzialmente, sì. But be careful. Religion pops up in places where you least expect it. I mean, look at the USSR, where there was an official communism that was also very repressive. Stalin had attended religious school and seminary, and he was someone who thought in religious terms. The real militant atheist was Lenin, along with Trotsky. Stalin thought in religious terms. Stalin took communism and turned it into a religion.
Gabriel used to say that someone was so atheist that they needed another church. Specifically, a Russian communist theorist said communism is the fourth great religion of redemption, born as another church.
Specifically, a Russian communist theorist said communism is the fourth great religion of redemption, born from Judaism. After liberalism, Christianity, and Islam. A church, a doctrine, an inquisition, the KGB, the Templars, doctrinal orthodoxy, the term orthodoxy, the cult of personality, the cult of the dead. The funerals of communist leaders were something. The funerals of Togliatti. There's a film, I can't remember by which very important Italian director, about the militant funerals of the Communist Party, about the funerals of Togliatti. I think you can also find it on YouTube. Then there are the choreographies, the cult of Lenin. In Russian homes, there's the icon corner. The government encouraged people to call it the Lenin corner instead, with a picture of Lenin. So you would find the picture of the Black Madonna of Kazan and the one of Lenin next to each other with a match in front of them. So religion remains because it's a mentality. A great scholar of the history of religions, Julian Ray, in the wake of Mircea Eliade, who is the one who invented the anthropology of religions, he argued that religiosity is innate in man. That is, the moment the primate comes down from the tree and looks at the sky and compares his own mortal finiteness with the infinity of the cosmos, in that moment, the religious phenomenon is born. So he even traces it back to the primates, to the first hominids.
Surely we all ask ourselves what the hell we're doing here.
Exactly.
And that's the first question you ask yourself. Personally, I've always kept looking. I mean, when you can't explain something, I've never, let's say, taken refuge in the idea that someone did it, someone created it. I mean, simply at the moment, we're not able to explain it. Let's say I've always had a scientific mind in this sense. We can't explain it, but that doesn't mean I have to make up another reason that's even harder to justify. Antonio Stigli, can the Pope's trip to Poland this week be considered the symbolic beginning of the end of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe? Look, before I answer that, I actually prepared for this. Look, I have a photo of Lech Wałęsa at the Lenin shipyards, who will receive the support of Pope Wojtyla. Before this, I want to thank the sponsor. I remind you that this live stream is sponsored by Enconi. I imagine you know what I mean. Like me, you always get these damn phone calls coming at you all the time, and you have no idea how you ended up on their lists. Well, just know that every time you registered on a website or a so-called free service, well, if it was free, it means that you were actually the product. So what does Enconi do? Enconi is basically a service that acts as an intermediary with data brokers on your behalf regarding your data. So it goes to them, asks them to remove your data. Obviously, it takes longer with some and less with others, and so on. What's the goal? To reduce the amount of information you leave circulating on the web. This helps not only to prevent your data from being resold for marketing purposes, but also to reduce spam, unwanted emails, phone calls, and things like that. So Enconi is a service specifically designed for the removal of this data. Less data online means fewer opportunities for profiling, but also a reduction in targeted attacks like phishing, email scams, and things like that. Unlike others, Enconi doesn't resell your data. In fact, it simply uses them in a way that benefits you. It costs little, actually very little, because if you use my code, you get a 60% discount. You can close it at any time, so it's not even something invasive. And on top of that, you solve my problems and yours. Remember, if they can't find you, they can't bother you. And I always add my catchphrase, which is, how much do you value your time? Some friends have done it, even people who maybe did manual work, and every time they had to get down from the ladder while working or something like that, just to answer a damn phone call, all that time saved is valuable. And in addition, you support what we do with the president, with Capitini, with Lanzara, and everyone else. This allows us to be independent and say whatever the heck we want without having to answer, my God, whether this video does well or not, whether the topic is super popular or not. This, for example, allows us to do live streams about South America, while maybe other YouTubers would choose not to talk about niche topics or those with less following because they don't get tons of clicks. Sponsors are also useful for that and for advertising. So don't look at them with disdain because they allow us to cover minor topics without worrying, let's say, about the commercial weight of it.
Here we are. Someone in the chat pointed out that the film about Togliatti's funeral is by the Italian brothers. That's correct. I hate being caught making a mistake about cinema. It's true. Thank you for pointing it out. The film is The Subversives. I linked it in the chat. You can watch it on YouTube. Two giants of our cinema, the Taviani brothers, Italians. As for why they call me the president, two explanations. One is, let's say, quite etymological, almost etiological, which is why I'm usually dressed elegantly, because I connect from the office. Actually, the real reason is because my first live streams were on a terrible connection. I would freeze often like Andriotti on Channel 5 with the host saying, "President, President," recalling that scene. So you see,
there's also the lore of the channels, right? Like how they come about. For example, why is Marco Bussi called the man in the low closet? Because he used to do live streams at 3 or 4 in the morning. We would meet up, and obviously, so as not to disturb his family, he would basically lock himself in the bathroom. I don't remember, in some damn closet at 3 or 4 in the morning. So that's why he's the man in the low closet.
Exactly. So I'm asking you for the next slide. You know I have a thing for books. What do you want from me? Actually, no, Pope Wojtyła before the books.
Probably Wojtyła, since examples of real active geopolitics and so on. He was also a particular pope, let's say, in a particular period. So he also allowed himself to make, let's say, compromises that others wouldn't have made. He used to go skiing. You know, we all know he was quite like that. There is definitely significance in what Wojtyła did regarding the solidarity movement in Poland. He mentioned that in 2020 they were celebrating the 40th anniversary. He supported and also sent various letters around, not only to Lech Wałęsa, but also to others right outside the shipyards of Gdansk and so on. He also sent a letter to Brezhnev in which he asserted Polish sovereignty. A pope, that is, a pontiff, wrote to the leader of the Soviet Union. Imagine something like that happening today. What would people say? A politicized pope, a pope who steps into politics. Well, maybe that was Cavalier's thing, but anyway, you know what I mean. It's interesting to see that it had a big impact. Obviously, he drew a lot from Polish Christianity, which was particularly sensitive to that support and so on. Then it later came out over the years that the Polish church was also being funded from outside. As soon as the Soviet bloc collapsed, a lot of things were immediately returned. The same happened in Romania. In Romania, during the Ceausescu period, you couldn't practice religion. People did it privately, locally, and there were still priests around. So how did the situation change? Basically, everything was reborn. So that means there was an underground movement that was active and working hard.
Yes, the impact of the thing, well, it's known to everyone, and thank you, Mirko, for reminding us. I saw two questions that I'll take from the chat, if I may. Leonardo Drago says to us, Leonardo Drago 893, good evening. In Northern Ireland, Catholics are about to outnumber Protestants. Could this lead to Irish unification? Yes, the Catholic demographic is more dynamic than the Protestant one. It could. The answer is yes, it could, but not for a long time. And anyway, I consider it not impossible, but unlikely. Because the Good Friday agreements are truly a very fragile balance on which peace in that territory depends. So, be careful. A territory that is becoming rich, because thanks to the agreements with the European Union, it is the gateway for the United Kingdom to trade with the territory, either directly or indirectly, by land, without barriers, and so on. So maybe prosperity will do more for peace in those parts than anything else. We'll see. There's another question I want to address because it's an interesting one. I'm going to find it. Funding. and about the Argentine desaparecidos. Actually, the church did take an interest in it. Were there some circles in the church that were a bit more reactionary and closer to the military juntas? Were there circles in the church that were more progressive and closer to the people? And especially to the victims of the dictatorship. So some sectors of the church took an interest in those events. Keep in mind that the peak of opposition between the Catholic Church and pro-American military dictatorships happened in Central America, not in South America. With the murder of Monsignor Romero, Archbishop Romero, by the Nicaraguan Contras, who was actually killed in church during Mass. So there you can see that the opposition was at its peak. In fact, there was a whole CIA operation to spread and support Protestant churches in Latin America. So what do you have? The United States of America becoming increasingly Catholic due to Latino immigration, and because some sectors of more traditional Protestantism are moving into the Catholic Church, a phenomenon called veins, just to be clear. And you have a Latin America that is becoming increasingly Protestant, because of the spread of pro-American and pro-Israeli evangelical movements, obviously. So actually those tensions and divisions really did exist. Not mainly in Argentina. Even though the entire Latin American Jesuit world had negative relations with the juntas. Pope Francis, when he was young, had been involved in a movement. The Iron Guard, a left-wing Peronist group, so not communists, were close to Peron. Why not the communist Pope? No, but he was a left-wing Peronist. The Iron Guard and the whole Jesuit world, in short, also flirted with revolutionaries. Fidel Castro studied with the Jesuits, for example, and then there's the whole topic of liberation theology. But here I differ to Mirko's Latin America experts. On liberation theology,
I'll ask, look, Diego Batistessa, if maybe he wants to do a live stream about the power of religion or simply Christianity in South America. Here I'm also asking the popes, but I want to speak at the Jubilee level, to the Vatican Secretaries of State, Casaroli. I would also include Zuppi for what he's doing now, even though he's a cardinal. We'll also get to Ukraine. Of course, there was a huge change between one pope and the other during the war in Ukraine in terms of positions, firmness, and statements.
There you can see the difference. A Polish pope cannot be pro-Russian. Even though Wojtyla was not the Russophobe he was made out to be, he proclaimed Saints Cyril and Methodius as co-patrons of Europe, together with Saint Benedict, because he paid close attention to the East and did not have bad relations with the Orthodox churches. Pope Francis, in short, can you really expect a Latin American Jesuit who lived through the Argentine dictatorship and so on to be pro-American? You can't ask this Pope to be anti-American. The sensitivity towards Ukraine is different, also because in Ukraine you have the Uniate Catholic Church, which is a bulwark of Ukrainian independence and identity. Clearly, since the time of 19th century Ukrainian nationalism, right? So obviously different sensitivities. Every pope also carries with him his own experiences, his own culture and history. We're getting to the organization of the Vatican now. I'll give you some reading suggestions. I'll answer that question with some reading recommendations. For those who read French, but there's also a translation in Italian, Arrêtant les Catholiques. This is a beautiful, concise book that explains Catholicism in terms of doctrine, organization, everything, how the church works. This is the handbook to start reading. Two good books on the ancient history of Christianity, which isn't just a European story. The Lost History of Christianity, the Church's Golden Millennium in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And the Origins of Christianity, a guide by Romano Penna. This is the
stuff of the 12 apostles, the obsession with 12, and so on, which even goes back to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Exactly.
And that use of the number, or the idea that we were created from mud, goes back to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
The ancient tradition. Exactly. The number of 12 apostles remains even after Judas's betrayal, because St. Paul is considered an apostle. Paul of Tarsus. So the number 12 is fundamental. The Lost History of Christianity, a good book, and The Origins of Christianity, which is kind of the main historical reference text on the subject. And now let's move on to the more intriguing books, because you asked me about them. The IOR, Roberto Calvi, Banco Ambrosiano, Funding to Solidarity through the IOR. Marci, do you want a coffee?
No.
No. No. I already had one. All right. Relations between the United States and the Vatican. Two empires, as we said, right? Massimo Franco, for the publisher Il Saggiatore, offers this book, Parallel Empires. I've suggested it in several other live broadcasts on other channels. It's the book about diplomacy, diplomatic history between the Vatican and the United States. Here too, because it talks about the so-called monolithic West, opposed to the rest of the world, right? The narrative of West against the rest. Nonsense. Until Reagan and Pope Wojtyla, there were no diplomatic relations at the level of embassies. That is, there was no nuncio in the United States. There was a personal representative of the Pope, not of the Holy See, not of the state organization, to the President of the United States of America. So it was from person to person. Do you understand? And it was Reagan who raised the relationship between the two states to the diplomatic level of embassies. Pay attention. Why? Because the United States is a country founded by Protestant millenarianism, and we don't like papists. Have you seen the movie Mississippi Burning?
Or The Gangs of New York.
The gangs of New York, the fights, the dead bodies in the streets.
Who had it in for them? He called them papists.
The Irish. What does the head of the Ku Klux Klan say in the movie Mississippi Burning? We are the Association of Southern Protestants. We don't want black people because we were created different. We don't want Jews because they reject Christ. We don't want papists because they kneel to a foreign head of state. Do you understand? The United States has had two Catholic presidents, Biden and Kennedy, during the election campaign. I mean, that was the atmosphere.
They mention an interesting point here, Nuremberg. Is it true that the Americans went to ask, and the English too, in Nuremberg, what the Pope thought about it, about a trial like this, crimes against humanity? They almost wanted the solution.
There were some approaches. I have read historians from that period who say that the film exaggerates it a lot.
Yes, that part, yes, it's really exaggerated, but they were definitely looking for it. I'm not saying a solution, but at least some support in this sense. It's also interesting to see the relationship that Nazi Germany had with the church. Germany wanted to replace the church. The pagan symbolism that they were reviving was a mix of everything, from Nordic cults to Teutonic worship. Just look at certain parades where they even used Teutonic symbols and so on. And in fact, this direction that Germany took in relation to the church and to Catholics was very frightening to the Pope.
A lot of fear. In fact, the Pope never went as far as excommunicating Nazism, thinking, we know what they're doing to the Jews. What if they get the idea to do the same to Catholics if we openly oppose them? So yes, it wasn't exactly an ideal. In fact, the Nazi regime had this cult of paganism, of blood, of race, against which the church has always spoken out. Racism has no place in a church that calls itself Catholic, and the popes have always been explicit about that. A church meant for the whole world, for everyone, right? Paradoxically, the greatest ambiguity was during the American Civil War, with the Vatican supporting the Confederates, because relations with the United States were not good. So the sympathy, if not outright support from the Vatican, went to the southern states and the secessionists. So you see, these ambiguities exist because you're not just a religious organization, you're also a state. So this dual role, this double identity is always there.
Look, they're asking, didn't Hitler set that up?
Yes, he established it.
Franz von Pape with Pacelli in 33, but it was more along the lines of this. We let you do your religious stuff, you don't get involved in politics, which was different in Italy, where the agreement was actually a political matter as well as a financial one.
In fact, it's true that instead...
But it was still in an early period.
Mussolini is the man of Providence. Providence, the priest-eater, socialist, Mussolini, atheist, I mean, for his whole life, except maybe in the final stages, becomes the man of Providence. Because he signs the Concordat, because he is a barrier against communism, which was the great fear. And the church didn't even protest when the regime, above all, suppressed Catholic associations, including youth groups, the scouts, and the parties. In fact, we send Don Sturzo to America, so we basically get rid of him. So the relationship with fascism was definitely better, that has to be said. A state also has secret services, right? And the Vatican has top-notch secret services because it has funding or diplomatic offices all over the world. They are required to report on their own country, periodically and systematically, on the economy, on demographics, on the politics of even the most obscure African country. So not only is there this diplomatic intelligence service, but there are real secret services. So secret that they don't have a name or an official organization chart, as far as we know. A real secret service is secret, right? The entity, the Sodalitium Pianum. There have been intelligence organizations that were officially disbanded but never completely disappeared.
Even taking advantage of international laws. As members of the church or NGOs, they have a much greater ability to move around than others. They don't get stopped, they don't get checked, their luggage isn't rechecked or anything like that. It's almost diplomatic in this sense. So they could definitely move through various channels, and often information was passed through church representatives, even in different countries where something was about to break out and so on.
So if I were you, if you're interested in these topics, I would read this book by Eric Frattini. Also because there are very few books on this topic, on Vatican intelligence. And of those few, many are sensationalist. I mean, it all veers into reptilians, conspiracy theories, or the Da Vinci Code, right? This is a serious book about one of the most mysterious intelligence agencies in the world. Why? I quote Aldo Giannulli. A secret service, when it works well, you don't read about it in the newspapers. Proof that the Italian secret services work better than the French, English, or American ones. Aldo Giannulli. Expert on the strategy of tension and on Marcinkus, Calvi, Banco Ambrosiano, Sindona.
He was on the Stagli Commission together with Verificare. He was on the Stagli Commission. It always cracks me up when he tells the story here that he sent the book to Andreotti with a letter, right? And then Andreotti replied to him, "You see, since you think we were on opposite sides of the barricade, that's why I'll read it." I mean, Andreotti would answer you and not answer you, right? That was his way, typical of Andreotti's remarks, right? I mean, according to Aldo, he was on the opposite side of the barricade. According to Andreotti, instead, since you claim we were on opposite sides of the barricade, so he doesn't make it clear which side he was on. Exactly.
Hello, exactly. Another world, other minds, other cultures, other people. Here, through his work as an archivist and consultant for the Stragi Commission, Aldo uncovered a covert secret service. It had among its political contacts, and his main political contact was Giulio Andreotti. This secret service is intertwined not only with the Moro case, but with a whole series of other Italian mysteries linked to the period of the strategy of tension. This well-known service and therefore also with the affairs of Father Zucca, a very important Milanese churchman. Connected to these murky circles where the Italian covert intelligence intersects with circles of the Christian Democrats, financial circles, and Vatican circles. So,
there's this book. I got to know it, and I met Aldo much later, but I mean, thanks to Marco Travaglio. Marco Travaglio, we're talking about 12 or 14 years ago. He did a report where he talked in defense of Aldo Giannulli about the fact that he had found these folders of documents in a closet. And for this, they were trying to crucify him precisely because he had found some stuff that probably wasn't supposed to come out. So that was the first time I heard about Aldo from a report by Marco Travaglio.
it wasn't supposed to come out, or maybe it was. The time was right and Aldo was well guided. Then he knew how to read and study those documents. So to your questions on these spicy topics, I can recommend some rigorous reading, because when it comes to these subjects, guys, it's easy to end up in Da Vinci Code territory. So you can have fun if you enjoy mystery, even by reading serious books. The support for Operation Gladio and then the communist invasion. So it's not like the Vatican says there's an operation called Operation Gladio. I support it. There were the stay-behind networks, a CIA operation, once that ended, another one started fairly soon, then with détente and the doctrine of flexible response. The Vatican almost certainly, actually definitely, knew about the existence of the stay-behind networks, but it's not like the Americans said, the Vatican supports us, so let's do it. No, it was an American operation throughout Europe. The Vatican was aware of it, and they definitely didn't mind that there were anti-communist resistance networks in the European continent. How could they mind? That's it.
So since Andreatti was behind the coup of the Forestry Corps, the American phone call that stopped everything and so on, the Black Prince, pieces
of stay behind, intertwined with the well-known service. So you end up in the Vatican. So I'll say it again, then there are the sources below. In my opinion, if you like these topics, these are the books to read. Last two slides. What is the future of religion? What we were saying before, on one hand, you have areas where atheism is growing. Paradoxically, the areas of the world where religion is less strong.
Paradoxically, the areas where welfare and social development are at the highest level.
Yes, this is a factor, but also where you have, if you want, rationalistic tendencies, parts of the Protestant world, and where therefore you get fewer answers to the big questions of life. They say there are no atheists in foxholes or on crashing planes, right? So in China, we see a return.
From a social point of view, you can see that the countries with greater development, where people are better off, where there is more welfare, more education, and so on, are the most atheist. So there is an impact on how much someone believes or doesn't believe based on the well-being and the society they live in.
Yes, that is definitely a factor. But I repeat, there's also the factor of how well it can answer your questions. On the other hand, next slide, the last one of the evening, look at how in the Muslim countries we associate with backwardness, religious fanaticism, and so on. The percentage of non-religious people is increasing. Where there is an imposition, people run away. If you impose atheism on me, like in some communist countries, there is a return to religion. If you impose a certain vision of Islam on me, people turn away from that kind of rigid, hardline imposition. So what can we take away from this? That religion prevails where it is not imposed, where it is a choice, where it is not a social convention, and where it gives you answers. There's the modern man who still has questions in the end. Where are we going? Where do we come from? Who are we? Those classic questions.
Religion should be like democracy. It can't be imposed from above.
Yes, otherwise it's a denial. Imposed democracy is not democracy, if you will, right? Imposed from above, etc. Same thing, that's that stuff. It's Julian Rees' monkey, right? That acquires an upright posture and sees the sky. This is what we can take away from tonight. The religious phenomenon changes but persists because, according to some anthropologists' theories, it is inherent to human nature.
It seems that the trend is towards non-religiosity over time. The more time passes, the more these curves will increase. Maybe then things change, and conflicts usually lead people to believe in something much more quickly.
Actually, I repeat, since 1991, with the collapse of communist regimes, there has been a great return to religion statistically. In that historical period. I repeat, it depends on the historical periods, it depends on the historical periods.
But there, it's always a coercive phenomenon. There, they were forced, they couldn't. Obviously, where there had been none, religion suddenly appears. Now, what you can or can't do, whether you're religious or not, things change. They change radically. It seems the general trend is this. It's exactly the coercive phenomenon. You forced me not to be religious, so out of spite, I go back to it.
Exactly.
That feeling, including some anger and desire for revenge, gradually begins to subside.
It starts to calm down, but then there's also something else. I repeat, the questions. I mean, Ernesto De Martino, one of the greatest Italian anthropologists, Death and Ritual Lament. Magical practices, thank you. By extension, also religious practices. He was a Marxist, so they are widespread in moments when you don't feel you have control over your life and you try to regain it. Yes, Mirko, there is an ongoing drift toward atheism in Western European countries, but look at how many people read horoscopes or follow informal forms of spirituality. Yes, there is.
No.
There is and always will be a demand for that, because human beings never have full control over their own existence.
What Winter says is also true, that people are moving away maybe from religions that are more, let's say, established, solid, with a history. But there are things like Scientology. I mean, a lot of other things are popping up, maybe more fragmented, more diversified, based on New Age, based on various religious movements, or on a guy who supposedly arrived here with a spaceship. Well, that's the Scientology one.
Emperor Zenu.
It sounds like a poorly written novel by some C-list actor.
Ron Hubbard is a science fiction novelist. Ron Hubbard, that's right, the founder of Scientology. No, but look, the historical periods that we associate with the triumph of rationality and science are also periods of magic as a reaction. The so-called Renaissance, which is the transition between the Middle Ages and the modern age, was an era of magicians. From Pico della Mirandola, who was interested in Kabbalah, to John Dee, who was truly a magician, right? The Age of Enlightenment, just imagine, rationality, the triumph of science, was a time when sects spread. It was the era of Count Cagliostro. If I'm not mistaken, even Newton was someone who was interested.
Also in parallel societies like Freemasonry and so on as an alternative.
So the eras that were apparently rationalist, I mean, today we live in an era of artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and Scientologists. California. Cosmic.
You can also talk, right, about the cult of technology, because that's becoming a cult too. The mess that's happening between Fedorov, Sersky, and so on is because that guy draws heavily from that school, quote unquote, from the Silicon Valley, where basically all human problems can be solved with artificial intelligence, with technology, with internet connection, and so on. That also becomes a dogmatic vision where that is the cure for everything.
Exactly. So the point is how to find an answer to this question, but in any case, human beings still have a need for the phenomenon of religiosity. Now I'm looking for it. I want to put it in the chat for you. I didn't think to include it in the book sources, but I think it deserves it because I mentioned it and I mentioned it a lot. Julia Ree, you can read all her texts. I'll put it in the chat for you. I'll put one of them. In short, interesting, the inevitable sacred, and maybe I'll also add Ernesto De Martino for you. Ritual weeping, there will be an addition because it's a classic. Here it is, Death and Ritual Weeping, from the Funeral Lament to Mary's Weeping. I'll put both of them in the chat for you.
They're also asking where to find them. I'll tell you, sometimes books that are hard to find, look for them on eBay, on Subito IT, look for them used. I sometimes look for weird stuff. So,
but look, I've put them for you. I've put them in the chat. There's De Martino here. I could add The Magical World. I'll put the IBS listings in there so you can order them. This is the anthropology of religion. So from here,
it could be a separate discussion. Here, we're just talking about religion. But it's not like during Nazism, they weren't trying to create another religion. There was always that part about occultism in the German world. It was huge expeditions to Nepal to find out what it was. Harti, La Galatea, the underground kingdom. I mean, if that religion isn't there, you have to create something mystical. You have to create it yourself. Exactly. Maybe even crazier, more absurd, based on even less, and so on. It's interesting that you have to replace one thing with another. You just can't do without it. Communism that becomes a religion, the cult of personality, the deification of people in power, which also goes back to kings who used to claim that, right? Why did the king rule, right? By divine right as well, right? Often. So last phase, Ukraine. In the war in Ukraine, we saw both the Ukrainian Orthodox Church becoming autocephalous, breaking away from the Russian one, and so on. It's interesting to see how the Russian side, on the other hand, supports the war and is very involved in the issue, because usually other religions try to stay a bit distant. I mean, even the Pope during World War II at least avoided glorifying or saying that things were done well and were justified, right? There was clear discomfort around those situations. Now, instead, at least in the Russian world, you see total complicity. They go and baptize and so on. They perform the rituals. Putin himself looks to this and draws on it, right? He personally goes with Kirill. I don't think he was super religious. If we look at him 20 years ago, he didn't appear so much in religious matters. So it's interesting to see how often men of power, okay, I need faith too. It also helps me to
progress.
Exactly, this tool. And it's interesting to see how that corner includes Greece, Ukraine, Russia, right? And they have a type of Christianity that's very different from that of the others. Their risk, yes.
The Orthodox churches have historically been national churches very closely tied to political power since the times of Byzantine Caesaropapism. That's it. The church is part of the state apparatus in the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox world. In the Western world, the Catholic Church fought the empire in the investiture controversy, and the two separated. The Pope never wanted to be subordinate to political power, but rather to be above it. So, as an unintended consequence of the Catholic Church's dominance, the secular character of the state emerged. Because it was the divorce. That's the point. Sometimes history plays these tricks on you. Mirko, if you don't mind, I authorize you to ask exactly. Morgano is right.
Absolutely.
I'd say goodbye because it's really gotten late for me. Yes.
I'm posting the link. I posted the link on your presentation.
I dropped 2 books in the chat just to wrap up because he mentioned them, by Mircea Eliade, Bolati Borinchieri. treatise on the history of religions and myth, dream, and reality, where he actually talks about this topic, that is, religiosity subsumed by the dictatorships of the 20th century.
So I want to thank President Maddaluno very much. We'll probably meet on the 22nd and then the 25th because things are happening, meetings. We don't know if Sirski will stay or if he'll be replaced. The issue of faith is becoming bigger than it seemed. Then I'll go on vacation between the 25th and the 30th, but I'm a jerk, so I'll manage to connect even from abroad to do some live streams. So definitely one on the 28th with Lanzara. Since you asked for it, I made a request for you about the F-117, and then I'll be back on the 30th or 31st. So thank you all.
But shouldn't we spice it up a bit? Shouldn't we tell them what's coming out in the fall? Can't we? No.
But they know I've already talked about it, yes. A book will be coming out with Mondadori, written by me, Capitini, Maddaluno, Lanzara, Battistessa, and Policieni. It's a book about global geopolitics and world affairs, explaining a bit of everything that's happening around the world. The title is still uncertain, but it's something like Atlas of Global Chaos, the World at the Front, a way to understand all the chaos that's going on. So thank you all. Good night.
Good night.